Right. I'll just double check that we're live on the YouTubes, but we should be. Video stream. Yes, we are. Okay. So welcome everybody. And for our next talk, we've got Henny Swan, my colleague here at TPG. Henny is a user experience and design lead here at TPG, and she's going to launch and introduce us to the Inclusive Design Principles project that she's been working on. So take it away, Henny.
Thanks, Pat, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I hope you're not all feeling too sleepy. I know I'm a little bit. I've listened to some amazing talks today. Full disclaimer, I live in Brighton on the south coast of the UK. We have enormous seagulls, and they are they have a tendency to flash mob me when I'm doing presentations or am on call. So I'm really hoping we're not going to get too much seagull noise this morning. So today I wanted to talk to you about some inclusive design principles that we've been evolving in-house. And while I'll be doing the talking, this is actually me representing a few of us at TPG who've been writing these principles, namely Ian Pouncey, Heydon Pickering, and Léonie Watson. And it's not really just us. We've been working on projects within TPG or prior to TPG. And this is kind of like a sort of our collective experiences and understandings of working with clients and with people on their products to try and put together a sort of a framework, really, in which to think about how we approach inclusive design. Behind every great site or application lies thought, empathy, and inclusion. Now, this doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. So we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and other guidelines which we need and are the foundation of building accessible websites and applications. However, there's not a huge amount within WCAG that covers design. And I think, you know, other than things like providing good color contrast and visible focus states, you know, things like that. And WCAG has actually got something of a bad press because people say, oh, it doesn't really cover design sufficiently, it's left out, etc. But I think that's probably a little bit unjust because design is subjective. It changes depending on the context within which you're designing for. So not only the platform, but the product, the people who are going to use it and how they're going to be using it. So it's not really something that you can distill particularly easily into a set of guidelines. And this is why we're using these inclusive design principles. They're here to help us formulate our thinking when we're working on client projects and to help guide our thought processes, as opposed to kind of come up with a checklist of things that we need to be doing when designing. So the principles are not here to tell you what to do or how to do it, but simply to spotlight pathways to help identify how to best shape your websites and products. So as Steve Jobs said, design is not just what it looks and feels like, design is how it works. And he's spot on here because how we design will directly impact how a website or application will be coded down the line. So good design will naturally lend itself to a more accessible and inclusive site, whereas bad design won't. And it was quite interesting. Yesterday, I tweeted and I asked within TPG if anybody had any good examples of good context-sensitive help, accessible context-sensitive help. And the response I received was absolutely zero, zilch, complete tumbleweed, apart from one lone tweet, which was from Pat Twit, who said, sorry, I can't share that with you because when you have accessible and inclusive context-sensitive help, you're not even aware it's there. It's just seamless. And that really, for me, points back to what Steve Krug said, which is don't make me think, which again, time and time and again, we come back to in presentations and when working with clients. But what I think has really happened over the years is while many people think about that, like, don't make the user think. We're not actually including disabled users in that process. We're not thinking about how, actually, are we making disabled users having to work that little bit more harder to use our websites and our application than we are other people? And that's really the crux of it. We don't want to put the onus on the disabled user. We want to make things easier to use. Jared Smith put this extremely well. I love this article called "Lipstick on a Usability Pig," when he said, applying accessibility techniques to an unusable site is like putting lipstick on a pig. No matter how much you apply it, it will always be a pig. And I think he's spot on. Because if the design is broken, you're going to come up with a site that doesn't work particularly well. And it's not going to work for all users, let alone disabled users. You know, we do a lot of remediation in our business and within our company. And it's very rare that I'll turn around and I'll say, sorry, we cannot make that accessible. Normally there's a way to tweak the code to make things better. But occasionally you get a design which is just so not correct that you have to come up with something which is really quite hacky and a little bit of a band-aid. And at that point, that's the tipping point at which you start to make something potentially accessible, but it might be just so kind of messy that it becomes unusable. And I've seen so many websites which are informant, but actually some of the design just doesn't work for everybody, and the knock-on effect is it introduces accessibility issues for people with different types of needs. So let's jump into our first principle. Consider situation. People use your interface in different situations. Make sure your interface delivers a valuable experience to people regardless of their circumstances. Now, this is quite interesting. I talk a lot with design teams, people, developers, and quite often when people are talking about accessibility and how to make things more accessible and inclusive for disabled people, they talk about people as blind people, screen reader users, voice input users, people with Zoom text. We're not actually framing our products in the context of these are people who, in fact, might be first-time users, repeat users. They might be somebody who sat in front of a computer at work. They might be somebody who's out and about with a mobile or sitting on a sofa with a laptop with lots of screaming kids around them. So people are people, and we need to people by their disability, but actually start thinking about how disability might impact, or situation might impact on disability. So let's look at captions on the go. So in the last few years, captions have suddenly kind of picked up pace, caption subtitles in the UK. People are including them much more in their content for many different reasons, but one of those would be that we are consuming much more content in video is on mobile when we're out and about. And of course, we don't want to have the sound up. We don't want to be antisocial. And so providers are catching on to this and having captions enabled by default, classic example being Facebook. And rather fortunately, I was looking through Facebook yesterday to go and get an example, and I happened to scroll down and find this video of America's Got Talent, which happened to be of a deaf lady who went on to perform and brought her sign language interpreter with her. And the screen grab I have is of Simon Cowell asking her, "Are you deaf?" And there it is in captions. I think this is a very good example of how actually goes beyond just including people with disabilities, so deaf and hard of hearing, but also people who maybe have situational limitations. In 2015, the Office of Communications here in the UK carried out a survey to see how many people were using subtitles, closed captions. And of the amount of people that were surveyed, 84% said they used closed caption subtitles, which is, exponentially high. So that backs up the data that so many people are using captions. You might be second screening, you might be looking at something at night, you may be in the office, you might be on the train, for example. Going back to thinking about the people who use your products and not defining people by their disability, Let's imagine a scenario where you might be doing your weekly shop, sitting on a bench at a train station, and it's very sunny, and you've got glare on your phone, and you happen to be low vision as well. So challenges you have anyway, you've got further challenges layered onto it because of your location and environment and what's going on. So it's important to think about what your users will be doing and where they'll be doing it when they access your products. Next up, we have prioritize content. Focus on core tasks, features, and information by prioritizing them within your content and layout. So this is kind of a no-brainer, really. You can look at this principle and go, well, this applies to everybody, and this is what we do. We try and prioritize our content all the time. But I think there are subtleties that perhaps do get overlooked when we don't think about the different types of people who are using our products, who might have access needs. So on screen, I have a screen grab of a website in the UK called Channel 5. It's a broadcast website, so you can go there and watch catch-up TV or find out about programs, etc. The screen grab was taken on my laptop, taking up the full screen of the laptop. And what you can see on full screen is a massive banner ad, a main menu, which has only got sort of 5 links in it, and then an image below that peeps up above the fold, which quite honestly, I don't really know what it is. It doesn't really give me much information about what it could be. As a user, as somebody who's looking at something in my browser at sort of normal zoom, if you will, I have to work a little bit to figure out how to get to the TV show that I want to watch. I have to jump around and work a bit. I have to scroll down, etc. But if you're using Zoom text and you have everything scaled up to, say, 300%, you're forced to work so much harder. And the site becomes sort of, you know, your efficiency of getting to the content you want is diminished considerably. So what you see on screen now is that white strip at the top has now taken up 1/3 of the screen, and then the rest of the screen is taken up by a banner ad, which is really... About 6 months ago, I was on this site and I was browsing with Zoom text, and I selected some cops and robbers show to watch. I can't remember. Downloaded. The playback page loaded, and this video suddenly played, and it was a chocolate ad that then stopped and nothing happened. And I thought, what's going on? This is not, you know, whatever cop show it was. And what had happened is, with Zoom text, everything magnified, the video was at the top. I'd inadvertently moused over it, expanded, took up the screen and pushed this advert at me. But because I was expecting playback of something that I'd selected, I was none the wiser as to what had happened. So the prioritized content had completely been lost. Prioritizing content also comes under how you might structure things as well. So we use headings so you can visually scan and get to things quickly and find where you want to go. Headings are also very important to provide semantic information to screen readers so that people who use screen readers can quickly navigate to key parts of the page that they might want to navigate to. So far, so good. So on screen, I have a picture of the BBC News website, which is a pretty busy page. It has a number of visual headings. So Corbyn, foreign policy must reduce a threat. This is followed by a short abstract, some information about the article, some related links, and a picture. Other articles have the article name, an abstract, and some thumbnails. Other articles have literally just the article name and the thumbnail. So this is quite a busy page. It's got a lot of content on it. When I go with a screen reader, we start to feel how really immensely busy this page is. So on screen now, I have a video playing of voiceover. The same page, I have voiceover navigating through the headings, and you can see the heading dialog box. And what happens is we're navigating through over 60 headings. Almost all of the page is marked up as a heading. Really problematic from a user experience perspective, because headings are there to get you to prior content. quickly and efficiently. If you have a lot of headings in the page, you start to really kind of, well, they start to lose their usefulness, really. They start to kind of prevent you being able to quickly get to where you want to go. So there's a snippet on screen that I've taken from the news page of the must-see section. And in it, you know, must-see is a fixed heading of H2, and then you've got H3s below it. Now, there's a number of H3s here, and a few of them are coded around just the article title, which sits below the thumbnail. That to me is not a heading at all. That to me is part of a list, really. To be coded up as a list. And if we were to start moving these things into a list, then the heading structure will start to become more clear and apparent and useful for people who are using a screen reader. And one thing that I like to advise, and again, this is not a compliance thing, but a user experience thing, is if you have a busy website that has lots of content that updates daily, hourly, then think about your structure and having the second level headings as text that doesn't change. So local news, world news, that's fixed. And things that do change quite frequently, consider putting those into lists if lists make semantic sense. But again, it will all depend on context. Next up, we have be consistent. Be consistent with conventions and their application throughout your interface. Now, consistency is all about familiarity. And what we want to do is build on what people already know in terms of how they interact with the web. So again, it goes to this don't make me think. The web is a very complex place, and we have very complex components such as tab panels, date pickers, the whole lot, frequently across the web. But what we really want to be doing is making sure that that these things are used, are built consistently and in a familiar way, so that as a user coming to your site using a keyboard, I can expect to be able to navigate around the tab panel in the same way that I did in a previous site. And this is where, with design teams, I point them to a technical spec, the way ARIA authoring practices, which basically outlines what the keyboard behavior, focus management, interaction, and the screen reader output should be for these complex interactions. And while it is a technical spec and it is something that is more directed at the developer, I think it is very important when we're designing components and thinking about features, whether they are custom or standard, we need to be using the same understanding of how people can navigate and interact with them. So the important thing here is to be consistent with design patterns which are out there on the web, but also to make sure that you use these design patterns consistently across your website. A few years ago, I worked at BBC, and we had many of the different products would have massive homepage carousels, but each of them were built by different teams, and each of them had different keyboard interaction. They had different wording for the next previous buttons, etc. So we had this design pattern that was really quite heavily used and on index pages of you know, news, iPlayer, etc. But they were all inconsistently implemented, which again, it just makes people have to work that little bit harder when they're moving from one place to the next. Additionally, we have used consistent editorial, including text alternatives used across platforms. So I think we're all aware that we need to be consistent with how our editorial is presented. You know, we always make sure that we have copy that is similar across different products, etc. However, something that is, I feel, very much overlooked is we don't think about the editorial that's being used by screen reader users, for example. That is a massive oversight, because what's really important there is, if I'm familiar with using a website on my desktop and listening to the alternatives for buttons, for links and navigation, it's really helpful for me if when I listen to that same website on Android or iOS, that the editorial is the same. It makes me feel like I'm in a familiar environment. It makes me feel like I know what I'm doing. It makes me confident that if I press this, you know, activate this button or link, that I'm going to go to the place that I want. the other layer that you get within that for free is you get a kind of a degree of audio look and feel, if you will, or even you could say some kind of branding. You know, the product is recognizably your product, and that reinforces it with the end user, with the screen reader user. One exercise I did at BBC was working on iPlayer Responsive, iOS and Android. These three things were all being worked on and relaunched at the same time. And I had an exercise where I went and harmonized all the text alternatives for buttons on that were replicated across all of those properties. And we then went on to do a very interesting project where we assessed the text alternatives for next, previous buttons, show, hide buttons, hidden text, text alternatives for links, etc., that were used for key navigation across a number of key BBC products. And then we sifted this down to come up with what we thought would be best practice. So again, you have consistent editorial for people who can't see the screen. Next up, we have offer choice. Consider providing different ways for people to complete tasks, especially those that are complex or non-standard. Now, it's important to highlight here that we all have different needs, and sometimes we cannot access things in one way, but we can access it in the other. But regardless of your needs, you should also be able to have a preference. And that's something that I don't think that we do particularly well. We don't give our disabled users a choice or a preference when they're using our products as to how they might want to interact with something. It's a bit like if you're seeing children play and you get this dominant child and they got all these toys and they give the less dominant child one toy and say, you have that one, it's the best one. But actually, is that the toy that kid really wants to play with? So we can't make assumptions that people want to use our products in a certain way. A great example of this is on touchscreen devices. So looking at the Mail app in iOS on screen now, this is great on a number of levels actually, because it offers choice in a number of different ways. So number one, gestures. So if you have a list of items in your inbox, you can either swipe to activate an action like delete or flag or go into the more menu, or you can tap to go into the item and where you can get all those controls as well, or you can go into edit mode and you can select to delete or flag things. What's great about this is, we're all different, and somebody who has issues with dexterity is going to be very different from another person who has issues with dexterity. Some people find it easy to swipe. Some people find it easier to tap. I know my mother-in-law and my daughter are very similar. They're at the opposite ends of the age spectrum. So when my daughter was 4, my mother-in-law is 75, I think now. But when it came to buttons on touch screens, they thought they were like buttons in the real world and would be pressing down incredibly hard and deleting all the apps on my iPhone. And swiping was a bit easier, say, for Patricia, my mother-in-law. So what you're doing there is accommodating people with different dexterity needs. The other thing we have is swipe to delete is a standard gesture, but not everybody knows about it because there's no visual affordance. This is where, as a screen reader user, you get more, apps can be actually a lot more easier to use because as you go onto an item, it will tell you swipe to activate actions, etc. But visually, there's no actual affordance to let you know that you can do that. I'm going to come back to choice a little bit in control, which is our next principle. Ensure people always have control over content and presentation. People should be able to access and interact with content in their preferred way. So as much as you want to give control, you do not want to take control away. So mobile, again, is a great example of this. Lots of features that enable access, and lots of kind of different settings that people can use. So here on screen, I have a small friend of mine called Sam, who I think he was probably around about 4 years old at the time. Now, Sam was injured in a car accident and was paralyzed from the neck down. He didn't have any head movement, but was able to speak. Sadly, we lost him now. And and could use a sit puff device. And here he is sitting in his wheelchair, and he has the sit puff device in front of him. And what you're not seeing off screen is his tablet, which is fixed onto the front of his wheelchair. Now for Sam, he has it fixed in, let's say he has it fixed in portrait mode. If your app forces users into landscape mode, that's it, game over. Sam can't access it. Now, this isn't part of any set of guidance. It's not part of any set of guidelines yet, but it literally prevents him from accessing your app. You get lots of TV apps which do exactly that. They make the assumption that you want to look in landscape, but actually that's not always the case. So you need to ensure that people have control to use things in certain ways. Another great example of this is autoplay. So I should qualify what I mean by autoplay, because it means lots of different things depending on context. So in this context, I'm actually talking about content that autoplays when one video stops, it continues. So it's kind of like continuous play. The other autoplay, of course, is when you download a page and video automatically plays. Now, it plays when a page downloads. We're all up in arms saying, well, we can't do this because it's bad for screen reader users. It drowns out their noise. However, again, it comes down to situation and context and giving people the choice and the ability to control what's going on. I spoke to 2 users at BBC who, on iPlayer, they would go and pick out a program to watch as their screen reader users. They'd hit the link, go to the page, and really what they wanted was for the video to just play. But instead, they had to navigate the page, find the media player, find the play button, and hit play. To them, that wasn't particularly efficient. That was just a whole bunch of other steps, really. You know, once you've made a decision, you just want to watch. That was great, users of iPlayer, but for someone who hasn't used it before, that's going to be completely throwing them through a loop. So again, you need to provide opt-in and opt-out and choices on how to control content. So on screen, I've got BBC News. What you have is a persistent button on which is together with the player controls, appears with the player controls, autoplay on and off at any point throughout playback. So you can change your mind whenever you want. So it's not buried deep down in preferences, it's there right up front. And what's really good is that they provide a choice in how you control autoplay as well, because as well as having it as a button on screen, you also have it towards the end of a video playing in a countdown. So you can absolutely, you know, it and get out of it if you need to get out of it quickly. So choice and control working well together there. Seeing a lot of great stuff happening in accessible gaming, and we've got a few presentations today. And this was an example shared with me by Ian Hamilton, who has done amazing work in accessible gaming, raising the profile, etc. And he shared this. This is from a game called Killer Instinct, and it's the settings screen. It has a number of controls where you can control different audio levels for announcer type, announcer volume, sound effects, really important, music, vocals, and ambience. And then you've got a HUD meter volume control, which allows you to change the volume on an element in the game that goes up and down, which you wouldn't necessarily be able to see, and whether you want to have it louder or quieter. So that was put in specifically for people who are blind, but I can imagine that would be something that a few people would want to use. Next up, we have provide a comparable experience. Ensure your interface provides a comparable experience for all users, so people can accomplish tasks in a way that suits their needs without undermining the quality of the content. So many interesting conversations when we were talking about this one, when we were kicking around what this really meant. Originally, we talked about calling it provide an equivalent experience, but there was a lot of sort of thought-provoking really around the fact that can we really provide equivalent experiences? I mean, this is a talk within itself. If you are blind and you are accessing audio description, can that really ever be equivalent to actually seeing the movie that's playing? You know, there's great audio description out there. I think Netflix is actually absolutely kicking it with their audio description. I have it switched on when I'm cooking, and I love it because it's short, succinct, and it tells me exactly what I need without any other fluff, and it's a really good experience. But ultimately, it's being able for me to turn around and look at the laptop when something happens. The same with subtitles and closed captions. We can do all sorts of magic to make them look very, you know, beautiful, easy to read, and color coding, etc. But is it really the same as being able to sort of hear the tone of voice that's coming through, and to sort of hear the ambient music? Lots of things that you can do to make subtitles more inclusive. So it's WCAG. You need to, one, have subtitles, closed captions, and two, they need to be synchronized with the video, which means that the text needs to appear on the screen at the same time that things are being said. If you have those two things in place, then you are compliant, which is great. But actually, that's really of how we can make these experiences much, much better. So on screen, I have a screen grab of I'm not sure what it is actually, I think it might be Casualty, and it shows two people talking to each other, and the top says you don't want people to find out in green, and the bottom line says there's nothing to find out in white, indicating that we have two different people speaking. And this goes back to that Steve Krug thing of don't make me think, because I look at that and I know that two different people are saying something, rather than reading that and thinking, oh, I don't know, is that one person saying something or two people saying something? I've got so used to looking at color-coded captions now, I use closed captions all the time, that I find it really hard work to go back to using captions that are not color-coded. So another thing is really around sort of decorative images and whether they should or should not have alt text. I'm sure you've all come across scenarios or been part of a discussion where you put 10 accessibility specialists in a room and you say, should decorative images have alt text? And you'll probably get maybe 25 different answers. It's always open to debate, and it's always down to context, but it is always down to the user as well. A logo, if you will, for the inclusive design principles, which really 3 hot air balloons hanging together in a calm, sunny sky. And that's what we've used as our alt text, not a literal description, because the literal description would be 3 hot air balloons, 1 in the foreground is larger, 2 in the background are smaller, with a cloud behind and the sun peeping out from behind that. So you could get very literary about it and write it nicely, but would that really convey what we're trying to convey in terms of look and feel? This logo, we wanted something that was happy, uplifting, calm, and inclusive, and made you feel like you could be part of something fun and interesting. And Léonie said, I used to have sight, so I appreciate descriptive alt text on decorative images. And that's her experience. That makes sense. There may be other people who would prefer not to have decorative alt text because they want to be much more focused in on the content. So again, when you're thinking about these things, you need to think about the context of use, what it might bring to the page. You don't want to use it as like a really heavy-handed branding exercise, because I just think that would be awful. It's like having flashing banner ads everywhere. But it's something that you might want to consider in terms of trying to convey a little bit of the sort of the look and feel of the site. On a slightly larger scale, this is a picture of Brighton Pavilion, which is just down the road where I live in Brighton. This was a completely over-the-top Maharaja-style palace that was built a couple of 100 years ago by the Prince Regent, who got kicked out of the King's Court for basically being a naughty boy. So he came down to Brighton and built himself a party palace, and Brighton hasn't looked back since. And it's absolutely phenomenal. Inside, it's just got all this. It's very famous for its chinoise decoration. It's super ornate, incredibly over the top, and absolutely gorgeous. And a couple of friends came to visit last summer, Victor and Caro, and Victor is blind and Caro has low vision. They went to have a look around the pavilion, and I met them for lunch afterwards, and they told me about walking around. So they buy their tickets and they get an audio guide and they start walking around the pavilion, and quite quickly said, this isn't really working for me. This audio guide is not particularly informative for me. But for Caro, it was slightly different because she has some sight, and she's an incredibly colourful visual person. Is read you out a short snippet from the audio guide. Now, this is a snippet that's about what happened to the pavilion during the Second World War when it was taken over and used as a temporary hospital. It'd be difficult today to visualize the building as it looked 100 years ago. But as we follow the tour, imagine the rooms with their royal furniture and ornaments removed, and with lino covering the floors and boards protecting the walls. You'll have the opportunity to see photographs of the pavilion during its time as a hospital throughout the tour. Quickly, we can see that this alternative format is not a one-size-fits-all. It's quite descriptive. It's pointing out what you can look at. It's telling you can see photographs of the war, but what if you don't know what the war looks like, or even how a photograph might be rendered, etc. So very, very visual. Now, they returned their guide to the front desk, and actually somebody showed them around the building, and they're completely set up to have people guide people around the building and explain it. And they got taken sort of behind the velvet rope. They were allowed to touch things. They were told stories, etc. So the stories really brought the whole pavilion to life. And interestingly, if you listen to the children's audio guide, they heavily rely on stories to try and communicate what the pavilion is like. And that was one thing that Victor said to me. He was like, I wanted stories. I wanted to hear about what went on, not have things described that I couldn't see. So our final principle is add value. This is I shouldn't really have favorites. I'm not sure if I do, but this for me is a really, really important principle, and is one that you should be, I would say, introducing before you've even started to work on your designs. This is when you're coming out with concepts and ideas about what shape your product might take, and what types of features you might need in order to meet the requirements of the business. So adding value, consider the value of features and how they improve the experience for different users. Now, you can argue that features add value for all users, but I would say to you that some features add particular value for disabled users. We live in a really interesting time of Internet of Things, Web of Things, connectivity with devices and our environment around us, and all of this can be done from a mobile phone. Whatever mobile device you're using is going to be your accessible device of choice. So you have all your tools, you have all your screen readers or Zoom enabled and set up in the way that you want. A good example is something called Chromecast. So Chromecast is a dongle. You can just put your TV into your internet-enabled TV. And what it allows you to do is, for an application that has Chromecast enabled, so YouTube, for example, you can navigate within the app on your phone, find what you want to watch, and then you can send it to your TV. You can cast it to your TV. A massive value-added feature for so many different types of disabled user. Number one, remote controls, incredibly difficult to use, and quite frankly, they're down the back of the sofa half the time anyway, or your kids put it in the freezer or something, so you can never find it. But equally, if I've got low vision, I can't read the programming guide when I pull it up on the TV without walking up to the TV. But if I can read it on my device, me. Equally, having speech-enabled TVs and set-top boxes is quite a pricey endeavor. So being able to use your device, which has set up as you want it and working for you as you want it, is just brilliant. And also, tip to parents, if you're in a different room when your kid's watching TV, you can also other things that we have in mobile devices. Think about all the APIs. so many different ones, voice API, camera API, vibration API, touch ID. All of these allow us to kind of bypass steps in navigation that can be quite cumbersome, that are not particularly efficient for us as users. So think about the voice API, which I have a screenshot of on the left, uses the voice API. This allows, if you have dexterity issues and you find the on-screen keyboard difficult to use, brilliant. Activate the voice API. The same if you can't spell. I'm a terrible speller, to the point where even predictive help just throws its hands up at me and walks off. So being able to use the voice search is a really, really big godsend. Equally, the camera API. So Amazon does great work in integrating with the camera API and voice API. So think about Amazon Pantry. You've run out of milk. All you need to do is wave your phone around if you can't see and find the scan, the barcode, and you can scan it, and then you've done your shop. Much easier than sitting down, opening the app and faffing around trying to get to a bottle of milk in Amazon Pantry. The same for Touch ID, and again, bypassing difficulties that you may have with inputting data with the keyboard. Using a Touch ID is great, especially when you have complex security and sign-in, which can be very, very off-putting if you have cognitive or learning difficulties. The point with all these, though, however, is there are people who will not be able to use the voice API, so people who don't have speech, who will not be able to use the camera API, or people with dexterity issues who can't use the touch API. So you should not be relying on these features alone. They should be value-added features. So you still have traditional keyboard search, predictive text, and make that all accessible, etc. So my colleague Billy Gregory has told me the story a few times about a gentleman called Johnny Taylor, and Johnny, like Sam, was in a car accident and was paraplegic. And he doesn't have the use of his voice or hands particularly, so he's very much reliant on iPad, etc. And Johnny was at a conference with Billy and a few other people. I think it was Accessibility Toronto coming up in September, quick plug. And they were talking around, how do we know when something is accessible? And they were sort of kicking around the idea of definition of done and how we can measure success and all of this kind of, smart stuff that we do. And Johnny just shared this by saying, well, how do we know when something is accessible? When I can use it. And that's just it. We have our guidelines, we have compliance, that can be measured, that can be tested. But to all intents and purposes, until we know that the people out there can efficiently complete a task, submit a form, get to the TV show they want, that's when we know that something is truly, truly inclusive. So I would say to you, just, do your testing, follow the guidelines, but take it back to the users. Include these principles in user research. Include these principles when you're actually designing your products, and think about people, our diverse users, and how they might be affected by your design decisions. A quick thank you, although there's a lot of text on screen. A thank you, obviously, to Léonie, Ian, and Heydon. They've worked really hard on this over the last few months. We also sent this out to comments to an amazing bunch of people who gave us some really good comment, which pretty much everything has gone back into the guidelines or will be put back in after launch, so more images, etc. So a quick shout out to Jamie Knight, Chris Mills, Glenn Gordon, Marco Zahe, Ethan Marcotte, David Sloan, Melanie Richards, Tom Waterhouse, Matt Atkinson, Charles McCarthy Neville, Patrick Lauker, and Justin Stockton. You can have a look at the principles at www.inclusivedesignprinciples.org. Massive shout out to Charles McCarthy Neville, because he's done a Spanish translation for us, because this is about inclusion after all. We have a French one in the pipeline, and we hope to get more out there as soon as we can. There's also a blog post going into explaining the background to the guidelines, and these slides are linked to from the blog post on paciologroup.com. Finally, I just want to say thank you for tuning in, especially for those for whom it's very early or very late. Enjoy your coffee or your beer. if you have questions, please do ask them over Twitter. We have a hashtag ID Principles. So feel free to ask us over Twitter, but equally feel free to ask us on the blog. This is design is ever evolving. So we hope to hear your experiences, get your examples, and evolve these over time and improve them if possible.
Thank you very much, Henny. Great stuff.
That's all right. Thanks, Pat.
That's okay.
So I think we've got time for questions if there are any.
Yeah, we looked over the Twitters, and I don't think there were any questions, but David's got a question for you.
Hi, Henny. There's been plenty of great comments on Twitter. I was wondering, there's various other sort of resources and principles out there. Could you perhaps give a bit of background into how these TPG principles are sort of built on those other inclusive design principles?
Yeah. So if you go to the blog post, you'll see that we've linked to a few of other sort of resources and guidelines out there, like the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, which is amazing, a web for everyone, which is brilliant, accessible UX manifesto. There's many more as well. The way nothing is original, nothing's kind of no, you can never take credit for something solely, and these are built on not just everything else that's out there, but also built on feedback and work we've done with clients, and equally with feedback and work we've done with end users and user research and stuff. These are not in competition to. We needed something that we could work from as a framework internally within TPG. So a lot of the work we do is what we call design reviews with teams when they're designing for a product, and we assess their visual designs. So a little bit of what we do is check the color contrast, check for visible focus states, etc. But the majority of what we do is looking at the components, looking at their features, and assessing how, assessing them for feasibility. Can these be made accessible? Is there a better way of doing this? And we've been using these principles to help us guide our thinking. And I for one, constantly I'm asking myself, are there two ways we can do this seamlessly? Is this value added, etc.? And a lot of these principles I worked on at BBC, in fact. And if you go back to the BBC How to Design for Accessibility, a few of them were kicked off there and evolved. So I guess it's part of the bigger fabric, but just, they're here for us to use, and we just wanted to share them and see if perhaps others would find them useful as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Pat, have there been any more questions?
Sorry, too many windows open. No, not that I've seen, but I've just tweeted out again the link to the website and the ID Principles hashtag as well. So if anybody's got questions or suggestions, have a look at that and tweet away.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Henny. And for everybody who's following ID24, we'll take a short 10-ish minute break and find us on the next YouTube video stream. Until then, see you in a minute.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.